When it comes to critiquing and discussing history, it's super easy to get things wrong if you don't do your research. I've been plenty guilty of it, so today we're here to set some facts straight. What do you think is a myth that should be busted? Let me know in the comments and let's dive into today. I'm gonna start off with a topic that happens to be a bee in my personal bonnet, and that's the myth that corsets were awful, tumultuous garments that hurt everybody and blah de blah de blah. The corset has developed an unsavory reputation since it fell out of everyday fashion, especially from scholars who understood it as a means of restricting women. Yes, they do alter bodies if you want them to do that, but they weren't the menacing health hazard that popular imagination assumes. That's just tight lacing. A Victorian woman did use corsets to attain a specific shape, but rumors claiming that, like, folks who were famous or fashionable surgically removed ribs to achieve the shape, it's never been substantiated. Well, during Victorian time. Also, the state of 19th century medicine and the resulting risk of any surgery only adds to the fact that that's not true. The myth of rib removal was most likely an extension and exaggeration of the fear surrounding corset use. Also, women didn't need a whole flock of assistants to fasten them in. They were often perfectly able to slip into the garment themselves. Too tight corsets also didn't cause women to frequently faint. Contrary to popular belief, women weren't constantly flopping onto fainting couches because their clothes were suffocating them. And back then, fainting couches weren't even a thing. That was just a daybed. I'm currently wearing a fashion corset, one of the many I own, and as somebody who has injured her ribs with poorly fitted steel monstrosities, well-made corsets are not harmful if worn properly, which is why I want to scream every time a Hollywood starlet thinks she's making a point by bashing them as anti-feminist. Tight lacing? Yes, a problem. Corsets as a whole? No. Moving on before I get off topic. Icky substances became increasingly taboo throughout the 19th century and eventually became associated with depravity and decay. Popular writers such as Charles Dickens seized upon this theme, and fiction exaggerated the presence of substance dens in Britain. I don't think I can say opium, but think of it like plant latex with side effects. Yes, sure, illicit substances were widely available in Victorian Britain because they had medical uses and were found in common medications. Like this plant in particular was known for quite a long time as a great way to relieve pain, and its use for surgical, anesthesia had been recorded for several centuries. But despite this availability, the country was not brimming with forbidden dens, although such establishments could be found around the docks of eastern London. For example, Matthew Sweets talks about this majestically in this book. He's like, yeah, there were 2 opium dens in London. Now, right now I could rattle off 2 Mary Jane shops within spitting distance of my home, and a couple of fungus strip places as well. So 2 dens in an entire city is not overrun by any means. Victorians ritualized mourning for loved ones both through practices and material objects, and although they employed numerous mourning customs such as preserving loved ones' hair and lockets and rings, they did not collect their own tears in glass vials. The discovery of small glass bottles in graves and tombs has persisted for centuries, and they likely contained oils or perfume, not tears. The growing market for Victorian funerary objects has imagined these items as tear catchers, adding to their mystique. And this is why it's important to do your research before you start collecting oddities, or else you risk being that newbie that experienced sellers want to oversell their junk to. I'm about to get really goofy with this verbiage, so bear with me. Another common misconception claimed a Victorian doctor invented the vibrating tool to help hysterical women. If you haven't had friends who have wished to be prescribed some love and no snow to deal with their trials in life, I think you need better friends. Okay, I know a lot of narrow spicy people. How can you tell? According to popular myth, doctors cured women of hysteria by manually bringing them to completion. One doctor, his hands so tired from having to help so many women, created this device to make his life easier. Yeah, all that a myth. There isn't much evidence to support the idea that Victorian doctors use those tools, or pleasure at all for hysteria. Yes, there is a Victorian doctor that is credited with inventing the electric device, but not for the purpose you're thinking. Joseph Mortimer Granville came up with the buzzing contraption in the 1880s, and the first iteration was basically an early version of the muscle massage tools people use today. It could supposedly cure a whole assortment of ailments like pain, spinal disease, but it was actually meant for men. He didn't suggest using the damn thing on hysterical women or actually women at all. This whole myth basically stems from a 1999 book, and the book's author has since said it was never intended to be taken as fact. So, folks, this is what happens when you don't fact check. One little rumor gets taken as truth, and then historians will forever have aneurysms over it. Queen Victoria has a long association with the color white, since after all, she did popularize the white wedding dress, but she wasn't the first public figure to wear white on her wedding day. More than 2 decades before Victoria's wedding, there's an account of Princess Charlotte's wedding dress, describing it as a slip of white and silver. Heck, I know I've talked about this recently, but Mary, Queen of Scots, caused quite the scandal when she married her first husband. Francis II. She was dressed all in white, and this was in 1558, and at the time, it was the French color of mourning. She arrived in triumph at Notre Dame Cathedral in a robe whiter than the lily, but so glorious in its fashion and decorations that it would be difficult, nay impossible, for any pen to do justice to its details. Her train was 12 yards long and made so heavy by all the jewels that it took 2 women to carry it. She also had this beautiful gold crown, matching pendant, all crowned with stones. She didn't choose the color to showcase purity, but also, going back to Victoria, she didn't choose white to showcase purity. White fabric was more expensive to maintain and clean, so wearing white was just a symbol of her social status, like, you know, I can afford this white dress, you can't. Only the wealthy could afford to maintain pristine white clothing at the time. Also, according to one biographer, she also chose white to show off the gown's lace. Contrary to popular belief, John Ruskin wasn't shocked by his wife's down there hair on their wedding night. The myth states that the sight was so bad that he was turned off and refused to consummate the marriage because of it. I love how the legend doesn't ask the state of, his down there hair. Just saying, preferences go both ways. The story first appears in the 1960s, and it's usually told that it's because Ruskin had only ever seen nude women depicted in classical statues, where they were hairless. But actually, he was pretty familiar with graphic adult content, if you will, from his time as an undergraduate. Yeah, he might have disliked his wife for other reasons, because apparently Effie Gray was, by Edward Lear's account, a rather irritating woman. Look, consummate the marriage or not, that's entirely up to you, pal, but I'm glad this myth was just a myth. I don't know why people think Oscar Wilde died of syphilis. Like, I get his pattern of behavior leading to higher risk for diseases and all, but geez. So in his biography of Wilde, Richard Ellman points out that yes, Wilde favored intercrural coitus, an act performed between the thighs without entering an orifice. And contrary to what is often claimed, Wilde didn't die of syphilis. Although, he probably did have it, he just didn't die of it. Which, it was probably because of his naughty activities as an undergraduate at Oxford. Geez, those undergrads. Instead, the cause of his death in 1900 was cerebral meningitis. Simple as that. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species wasn't the first book to propose a theory of evolution. Far from it, by the way. There had been theories of evolution before, notably those of Lamarck. His idea being that small adaptations made by an individual in their lifetime would be inherited by their offspring. And Robert Chambers, whose beliefs of the natural history of creation caused a stir when it was published anonymously in 1844. But Darwin's was the one which explains the process of evolution in a way that could be observed and tested. Indeed, theory of evolution is kind of misleading, since the science theory doesn't mean hypothesis, but a statement which has been tested and never disproved. People weren't shocked so much by the evolution part of Darwin's book as by the natural selection part. The idea that all life is reliant on, to quote, Tennyson, nature red in tooth and claw. But I guess, Lamarck Award doesn't quite roll off the tongue as easily as Darwin Award. When it comes to all things freak show and sideshow, I'm not saying performers weren't treated horribly by company owners and employers at all, but it wasn't as common as folks want you to believe, especially when it comes to how the crowds reacted. The myths about mocking and patronizing disabled people through the gruesome Victorian freak shows is, well, mostly a myth. Anybody involved in modern day sideshow feats will be the first to tell you that we call ourselves freaks on purpose. This is largely a 20th century creation, with films like David Lynch's 1982 classic The Elephant Man playing fast and loose with the facts, and suggesting that people like Joseph Merrick were mistreated by their managers and agents. Many folks tended to be treated as celebrities, revered by their audiences as curiosities, sure, but also as performers, and also earned quite the fortune from their careers. The word freak didn't really get used as much as people think. One of the rare occasions when the Elephant Man is described using that word is in a book authored by none other than the man himself. Yes, some cases of awfulness and harm did exist. Barnum, I'm looking at you. But performing in freak shows was a way for folks to make a rich living with the card they'd been dealt with from birth. I rest my case. Victorians have a reputation for being overly prude and coitus-averse, largely thanks to Queen Victoria's buttoned-up public image. But their art and literature says very much otherwise. Queen Victoria herself had an entire collection of nude paintings. Also, she and her husband, Prince Albert, delighted in giving each other risque artwork as birthday gifts. According to her own diaries, Victoria was a pretty passionate lover. When writing about her wedding night, she said, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest dear Albert sat on a footstool by my side, and his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." She did not, as the saying goes, just lie back and think of England. Look, I just want to know what the footstool had to do with anything. And also, Victorian literature featured its fair share of naughtiness. One particularly famous book was filled with a man's vivid account of his intercourse adventures. There were even a couple of how-to books. One, which was titled An Infallible Guidebook for Married and Single Persons in the Matters of Utmost Importance to the Human Race, was essentially the Victorian version of Coitus for Dummies. The book, which is filled with some pretty dubious advice and information, even encouraged married couples to have passionate fun times, claiming that any descendants conceived would be most like the parent who had the most intense completion. And that's it for me again, folks. I've been Alexa, the resident emo girly, and hey, if you enjoyed my ramblings today, could you help us out by giving this video some love? And I'll see y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.